Here, they don't even provide medical attention. NGOs like Physicians for Human Rights have to come in on the weekends and open up clinics on the ground.
My name is Jacob George. I'm from the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas. I'm a 3-tour veteran of the Afghan War.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 25 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. In September, the Israeli High Court overturned a grim Israeli law that gave African asylum seekers two choices. One, return to the country from whence they fled, or two, to stay in a detention center called Halot in the Negev desert indefinitely. The court told the government to close down Halot within 90 days. Earlier this year, David Sheen had toured North America giving talks about this very subject. Sheen was born in Canada, had gone to Israel in the 90s as a committed Zionist, but he woke up very shortly, particularly about the situation, the racism shown towards Africans, black Africans from Eritrea and Sudan who had come to Israel recently, but also about long-term racism towards black Africans that had been endemic in Israel for a very long time. Most of our program today will be a video that Sheen created of his videos and photographs that he took inside of Israel, and a talk that he gave in Vancouver, Canada, as part of his tour. We'll also close with a tribute to a U.S. veteran and reflect on that slogan, support the troops. We jump into David Sheen's talk as he is exposing Israeli attitudes towards Africans.
So in 2012, you have Miri Regev, as I said, declaring that Africans are cancer, slagging them. But even as far back as 1980, you have member of Knesset Dov Shilansky, later on the Speaker of the Knesset, saying that all the Africans should be put on a boat out at sea, and people calling to drown the boat, drown them all at sea. And in 2012, you have a Knesset researcher preparing an official Knesset report, which went to official police statistics, found that Africans consistently have lower crime rates than native Israelis. And because his report exonerated them, the Israeli government tanked the report, pulled it offline, and demoted him from his position. The same thing happened in the late 70s with David Glass, member of Knesset, preparing this report on the African Hebrews and noting that police statistics showed they had lower crime rates than Israelis. Yet he was dismissed from the party and his report was never followed up on and shelved. And just as today, you have the vast majority of Israelis calling for all Africans to be kicked out. Okay, 61% want them all deported from the country, 18+% wanting them all jailed. So that's 80% of the Israeli Jewish population demanding that all African asylum seekers are rounded up out of Israeli cities. And back in the day, early 70s, same thing. A poll showed that most Israelis wanted the government to kick all the Africans out. Now you have the mayor of the city with the largest concentration of Africans, mayor of Tel Aviv, demanding that the government kick them all out of the country. Back in the day, same thing. Mayor of the city with the largest concentration of Africans, then it was Dimona, demanding the government kick them all out. But nowadays, the mayor doesn't only talk about it, isn't only demanding it, he's doing it too. He's sending his municipal inspectors to do their part, sending them into African restaurants to pour bleach into the cooking pots of the African restaurants so that there's no possible way that they could make a living. Last year, Even the US State Department issued a report calling Israel's treatment of African asylum seekers a most significant human rights problem. But once again, the government completely ignores the report. And with Netanyahu re-elected to power, in the new government, he appoints that very same woman who called Africans cancer, who incited the race riot. He appoints her to head the Interior Committee, the very committee that determines the fate of African asylum seekers. Now, I should be fair to Miri Regev. She did apologize for calling Africans cancer. But she didn't apologize to the Africans. She apologized to Israeli cancer victims for comparing them to Africans. And the government in March 2013 issues a report, the Sofer report, which puts together a policy for the government how to treat asylum seekers. And among the findings of this report is that those Israelis who advocate for Africans are labeled anti-Semites and potential terrorists. Premier terrorist, I guess, this Jewish booby here in the bottom right-hand corner, clearly a grave threat that you wouldn't want to encounter in a dark alley somewhere. Now, because no one's doing anything, and the Israeli government is passing measure after measure, and there's no objections, seemingly, from the world, from the international community. So it realizes it can do whatever it wants to, and it begins to outright deport African asylum seekers back to the countries they fled from. Now, I don't know if it was fate or coincidence or whether it was intentional, but the day that they began the deportations, July 15th, was exactly 75 years to the day after the Evian conference. If you haven't heard of the Evian conference, on the very eve of World War II, when it was already quite clear what the Nazis intended to do to the Jews, here the United States and the UK and other countries all met in Evian in France, and they convened to decide, well, maybe if you take in some Jewish refugees, and maybe if we take in, and maybe if they take in, then maybe we can save these people from being butchered. And in the end, none of these countries wanted to take in any Jews because they were Jews. And in the end, on the same day, 75 years later, Israel begins deporting these Africans because they're not Jews. Once Israel does this, then according to the UN representative to Israel, Miki Bavli, he calls that the gravest violation possible of the Refugee Convention that Israel has signed, a crime never before committed. Now, September 2013, a year and 8 months after the government passes the anti-infiltration law, the Supreme Court says, this is an egregious violation of human rights. Unanimously, by a decision of 9-0, all Supreme Court justices overruled the law, call it unconstitutional, and demand that the government release all African asylum seekers from Israeli jails within 3 months. Right after that, the Attorney General announces to the police officers, continue arresting Africans, ignore the Supreme Court decision. The government simply initiates a new law, identical to the old law in every way, but even worse than the first. So now, instead of arresting Africans and jailing them for 3 years in order to make their lives miserable, under the new provision, they can be held indefinitely, infinite amount of time, for life, potentially, until they choose to self-deport. And so at this point, African people realize there's nowhere to go. Their backs are up against the wall, and they have only themselves to count on. They can't wait for some Supreme Court to rule in their favor. The government will ignore it in any case. And so people come together. And this is no easy feat because these Africans are from different countries and they speak different languages and they're from different ethnic groups. But amazingly, they did. Here, Tel Aviv City Hall, 25,000, 30,000 people protesting, demanding their refugee rights, trying to appeal to the government and to the Israeli population, saying, we're not asking for much. We're just asking that you follow the letter of the law. You signed on to these international agreements. You co-authored this refugee convention. Abide by it. Just examine our applications openly and transparently as you were required to, or else extract yourself from these conventions if you don't mean to abide by them. But if you do want to remain a member in good standing of the international community, then examine our refugee requests. For those who aren't, they'll have to go. But for those who are refugees, we deserve our rights. And so you have people protesting in front of the American embassy and in front of the Canadian embassy, in front of the UN, in front of the AU, really teaching Israelis a lesson in democracy, whether it's in front of the Knesset here or the Prime Minister's office, and really trying every non-violent tactic that they can think of, if it's a sit-in or a sleep-in or a teach-in or it's really inspiring on one hand to hear, like you heard when you were first filing in and I played that video and you could hear people chanting, "We want freedom, no more prisons," and to be surrounded by throngs of thousands of people just demanding their human rights. It's incredibly inspiring, and at the same time it's incredibly depressing because no matter how much they protest, the government just outright rejects their demands and says, we don't care. You can protest as much as you want. You can strike as much as you want. We're going to continue rounding you into these camps and until you agree to self-deport. And the population, as you saw, firmly backs the government's position. So it seems like there's no hope of any internal force breaking this vice grip on the African asylum seekers. And what are these desert detention centers that the government is rounding people into? It's funny because at the beginning, Israeli people, like most people in the world, want to have a positive self-image. They want to think of themselves as good people. So they couldn't allow themselves to imagine that this was a horrible place. So the government pitched this to the population as some kind of country club, with recreational facilities and with educational facilities. You wanted to go there. It sounded so good the way they made it sound. Of course, it's horrible, as you can imagine. It's in the middle of the desert on the border with Egypt. It's surrounded by nothing except a firing range. They've got nowhere to go and nothing to do. They're crammed into these trailers with no heating in the middle of the winter. There's no insulation, nothing. They don't even have hot water half the time. Food, if you can call it that. Often they miss meals. I don't know what this pink goop is supposed to be. It's certainly not food by any stretch of the imagination. No nutritional content, no fruits, no vegetables, nothing. No educational, no recreational. There aren't even medical services there. How negligent can you get? A country that supposedly can send, delegations to Haiti and to all these other places in the world where they suffer from natural disasters, it can't even murderers and rapists deserve medical attention. Here, they don't even provide medical attention. NGOs like Physicians for Human Rights have to come in on the weekends and open up clinics on the ground outside these detention centers. That's how pathetic it is there. And probably the most insulting aspect of all is this sign that they put up, the Office of Employment. Employment for the society. I couldn't imagine a more Orwellian sign at the entrance to a detention center. This is the only thing they've left for us to be reminded of. Arbeit macht frei, at the entrance to Auschwitz. Now, are you offended that I would make such a comparison, that I would dare compare these detention centers to concentration camps? Well, you damn well should be offended. And you should direct your anger and your rage to the Israeli government, who isn't even embarrassed to use these words. They know no one's looking, they know no one cares. So even in that official government report that I described earlier, released in March 2013, look it up yourself, it's online, in the Hebrew, I've translated it here for your benefit. It calls for the concentration of Africans. Open up any Hebrew English dictionary in the world, and you will find that the word rikuz is translated as concentration, and a machane rikuz is a concentration camp. Okay? Now don't get it twisted. I didn't say death camp. I don't think there's any firing squads or crematoria or gas chambers or anything like that. Nothing like that. But it is a concentration camp. Okay? A concentration camp is a place where people are forced to live under harsh conditions because of their political opinions or because of their ethnic affiliation. And that's what's happening to these Africans because they're non-white, non-Jews, and no other reason. Concentration camps existed long before Nazi Germany. United States opened up and rounded Cherokee Indians into concentration camps as far back as the 1830s, and many nations since then. And after World War II, many countries opened up concentration camps. Sadly, many countries have done this well before and well after World War II. Okay? And that is what's happening today in Israel. Even the president of Eritrea, this despicable man who's responsible for thousands of his own countrymen fleeing every month, even he is called these detention centers, concentration camps. And frankly, he's not the only president to do so, because this man, Reuven Rivlin, member of Knesset, former Speaker of the Knesset, and currently the leading candidate to be the next president of Israel, publicly called these detention centers concentration camps. Okay? So take it up with them if you're offended. And why is it that when journalist Max Blumenthal puts out his book Goliath just a few months ago, and he describes these scenes taking place in Israel, and he calls the chapter titles the concentration camp to describe the detention centers, and calling the anti-African riot, calling it the night of the broken glass, evoking Kristallnacht on the eve of the Holocaust. So why is it that when he makes these comparisons, that American Jewish intellectuals are vociferous in their attack on Max? You know, how dare he make this comparison? Yet these so-called intellectuals have not one word of criticism about the actual events described in the book. They've got nothing to say about the government's war on Africans. January 2014, African family standing in downtown Tel Aviv, woman holding her child, her 1-year-old baby in her arms. An Israeli man walks up and stabs the baby in the head 3 times. Of course, within minutes, the police were quickly issuing press reports. No, this was not related to racism in any way. This man was just crazy and, drunk and... Please. Of course, it was a white man who perpetrated the crime and a black victim, so of course there was no racism involved. Oh, he must have been crazy. Where have I heard that one before? Well, in the weeks that followed, sure enough, this man's confessions were released to the media, and then we saw for ourselves what he had to say. Why did you attack this baby? I tried to kill her because I hate them. They're black. A black baby. Blacks in general are terrorists. Did the daughter of a whore die? Now, I don't mean for a second to suggest that this is across the board, that all Israelis can be compared to this man. Clearly, anyone who stabs a 1-year-old baby is psychotic and can't be compared to, the masses. But why did he stab a black baby? Because for months and for years, the Israeli government has been inciting racial hatred towards Africans. How long does this have to go on for? How many more black babies? What can we take from this? The people who want to kick out these kids because they're not Jewish are morally no different from the people who wanted to kick out these kids because they were Jewish. And the only moral lesson that we can take from the Holocaust is not never again just for us. It has to be never again for anyone. So, unfortunately, I don't have any happy story to conclude with, to end it on a cheerful note. But I just want to implore you to, at your leisure, go onto my website, read these articles, watch the videos. I have over 100 resources on this topic. The mainstream media is censoring it. It doesn't want people to know what's happening. Go there, find out for yourselves, and spread this. Only through citizens networks and your social circles, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, can we spread the word. And only then can we hope to perhaps create some kind of consensus or some kind of pressure from the international community to end this ethnic cleansing. That's it. Thanks.
For a link to Sheen's full video, go to our website, thestruggle.org. Now, you would think that this High Court decision would mark a huge change in Israeli government treatment of black Africans. However, I emailed Sheen about this, and his answer was to remind me that this was really the second law. The first law had already been overturned by the Israeli High Court, and the only result was that the politicians got together and made this second law. And now he says they are coming up with a third law to try to go around the Israeli High Court decision. Finally, let me remind you of something, how much the Zionists cried out about the horrors in Darfur, in Sudan, when they were using it as a club to embarrass Arabs. Now that they could be helping actual Sudanese in Israel, all we hear is racist garbage about black Africans. Whenever the U.S. military launches a new attack, the politicians trot out the slogan, "Support the troops." Well, one effect from these invasions and occupation is on the mental health of U.S. troops. And when they realize what they actually have to do to populations, there's mental injury. And often, as is going on now, a big spike in the number of soldier suicides. I saw a report on this on corporate TV, the usual cliches, and the recommendation that there be more money going for mental health for U.S. soldiers, as if it was just a matter of spending more money on a few more pills or a few more doctors. On Democracy Now!, they gave a report about the hard truth about one U.S. veteran.
As we end this segment with a remembrance of Jacob George, an Afghanistan war veteran and peace activist who took his own life earlier this month. George co-founded the Afghan Veterans Against the War Committee, part of Iraq Veterans Against the War. In 2011, he and fellow veteran Brock McIntosh returned to Afghanistan to meet with young Afghan peace activists. McIntosh remembers George bonding with a 15-year-old Afghan boy who, like George, was a farmer. Together, they discuss, quote, the absurdity of poor farmers being sent to kill poor farmers while people are starving. McIntosh said. George was also a musician who biked around the United States playing music for peace, a campaign he called A Ride Till the End. In 2012, at the NATO summit in Chicago, he was among the veterans who hurled their military medals toward the NATO summit gates in an act of protest against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
My name is Jacob George. I'm from the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas. I'm a 3-tour veteran of the Afghan War, paratrooper and sergeant, and I have one word for this global war on terrorism decoration, and that is shame.
George spoke openly about his struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder and with getting VA counselors to understand what he saw as a moral injury from his time in Afghanistan. In a storybook that accompanied his musical album, Soldier's Heart, Jacob George wrote, quote, "A wise medicine woman from Arkansas once told me that grief is pain trying to leave the body. If you don't allow yourself to grieve, it gets stuck. But once you grieve, the body can heal itself. I won't lie, some of this stuff is heavy, but telling my story is a part of my healing process. And it's not just veterans who need to heal. All of us need to heal from war and the roster of ailments produced by a nation at war," he said. Jacob George killed himself on September 17th, 1 week after President Obama unveiled the new U.S. military mission against ISIS in Iraq and Syria.
Finally, I urge you to listen to our interview with Syrian-born Professor Yasir Munif. He talks about the early results of Obama's bombing attack on Syria. It's increased recruitment for ISIS. It's bringing smiles to the Assad regime. And by bombing grain silos in one town, it's created a local humanitarian disaster. Hear it by going to our website, thestruggle.org. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.